with emotion, music very rarely presents a portrait of a single static feeling. Typically, there is evolution, change, mixing of emotion, and that kind of progression. And so the issue of where the emotion goes is a very big one. And I make a distinction between two broad categories of feeling. This is in a way like a fourth parameter, that we have incomplete states of mind and we have complete states of mind. And these don't overlap perfectly with affect. But so imagine you are an architect, to refer back to Fred's book, and you've got in mind this beautiful vision of the sun shining on the new building that you've designed. So you feel simultaneously two things: a warm, inspirational, positive feeling, which is the affect, but also get up and go, right? Drive, like, oh, I got to write the plans down. Okay, I'm going to have to sell somebody this design. I have to get the financing. Your mind goes with, let's move ahead with this. So there's two aspects of things. It's an incomplete emotion. It's an emotion that requires some form of closure coming later. It requires an achievement or a coming together. And this relates back to Aristotle's concept of catharsis. There's a whole conversation we can have about what catharsis means, because most people think catharsis means purging, and I don't agree with that.
It just means change.
I think it means more than change. I think catharsis means a process of conflict or incompleteness or mystery or some form of unsettled state, which then you take apart and rework and reshape and then put it back together to solve the problem. And that coming together is what we mean by catharsis. That's my idea of what catharsis means. I understand that most people think catharsis means purging from, Aristotle's actual historical writing on it is ambiguous between the two.
Yeah, to combine different moods, different at the same period of time. I could see you maybe doing a whole chapter on holiday music, Christmas, Hanukkah,
yes.
how different types of carols and songs affect people in different ways. They can be happy at one point, and then all of a sudden they're thinking about a loved one that's not there anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, and I wondered if you were going into that territory
Yes.
as well.
So all of the uses of music or attachments of music to movie or ceremony or holidays are a consequence of its emotional content. Sometimes when people are desperate to make an explanation, they would switch the two around and say, this is happy because it's Christmas music, but it's actually music written to be happy because that feeling is wanted and it's happy music. Even if it wasn't for Christmas, it would still be happy. If somebody called the Brahms Lullaby Terror Over the Spaghetti Monster, it would still be serene, right? And a kid might be scared of a monster under the bed, but that da-da-da-da-da is still a serene sound. I think you had your hand up
Yeah,
first.
two concepts that I'd like to be clearer about: intensity and tone.
Yeah.
Could you explain those?
Well, tone is a term that can have different meanings in different contexts. Are you asking what I meant when I was saying tone?
Yes.
So there's a variety of synonyms that I use in the affective dimension. You can call it valence, you can call it affect, you can call it tone, quality. They're different words to name the color of mind, whether it's a blue feeling or, I'm so angry I'm seeing red, that kind of thing. So there's a whole, affect is the great unexplored territory of the mind and of emotion. So there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff to go into in that aspect. I go into some of it in my book, but there's going to be even more. But
so the gradient for tone is happiness or sadness, basically.
that's the bifurcation, and then you have degrees within each category.
All right.
Right? Because you can have deep, deep, brooding melancholy or faint irritation, which is a little more just gray. And then in the happy category, there's bright, bright sunshine versus pale.
And then intensity?
Intensity is,
As you're using
intensity in music, the simplest form of intensity corresponds with loudness.
Okay.
There are other factors too, like if you have a whole buildup, that intensity carries over to the moment you're in now as a form of contextual memory. Yes?
Well, we talk about motion picture scores.
Yeah.
I just came from a Noel Howard retrospective where brief encounter, you hear Rachmaninoff, and you automatically get like an emotion. but something like Fantasia.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if you go into any of that with Fantasia, because when people hear Tchaikovsky, they see dancing mushrooms, you know? It's like,
Yeah, right. So this goes to music being connected up with other things, whether it be a theatrical performance, an image, like pictures at an exhibition is program music connected to a set of images. And so that's going, I'm telling you, in the debate that you have with people, it's going to hook up with associationalism, and they're going to say, yeah, but that could be anything. It could be Fate or Kate knocking at the door.
How does modern musical theory treat artists' intentions, and does that need to be reconciled with whether or not emotion exists in music?
Ooh.
So yeah.
Yeah. So the purpose of the concept of the psychological signature in my system is to separate out what is universal in the psychological response to the sound. And there are all kinds of things that need to be distinguished from that, even though they are related. And the composer's intention or the performer's intention is part of that. And there's obviously a causal connection, because what sounds the composer puts into the piece, or how the performer interprets the piece, is shaped by what their intention is. Now, of course, then you get also into the issue of competence, because you can intend to have a great epic sound and you create a meager one. So there is that possible disparity, which is part of the why.
How does modern musical theory treat intention? Do they say it's irrelevant and?
Oh no, that intention is allowed in for whatever reason.
So if the composer intended to feel sadness or happiness,
yes,
and nobody cares because the intention was an emotion.
Well, see, this is because people have never had an answer to the question of musical emotion. They desperately fish for truth, for ways of validating it, for ways of proving it by associations, or by saying music represents something like a painting does. And composer biographies and intentions are some of the famous and favorite things to go for, because that feels solid, it feels grounded, but it doesn't really prove it.
Yeah.
Because if I intend to evoke joy and I produce the notes of the funeral march, the intention is at total disparity with the actual sound. Yeah.
Another music question. Do you find, somewhat like some linguistics analysts say, that there are things so basic, they're basically human universals, and then others that vary drastically with culture? For instance, I've heard, at least, that there are compositions that sound happy to almost all Western listeners, but somber to many Indian classical music listeners. Yes,
well, this comes to the logic rule of define your terms. Because if you are using presumably a foreign language word in the foreign language, if it's in Asia that the same piece of music is being tested. So there's a vocabulary problem and a definition problem going with that. And is it subjective? No. And one of the additional distinctions that I bring in is just to say very briefly, the difference between what I call note system elements versus sound flavor elements. Because there are different timbres and different linguistic characteristics that are very, very culturally variable, and you must acclimate to them in order to get them. But the issue of what is the tune, how do the notes relate to each other, how fast is it, those are universals. And if you can get past the sound flavor elements, or maybe you already are familiar enough with them, then you hear the music. And the music is a universal, even if the qualities of the voice or the different pattern of language sounds are different. That's a separation that needs to be made also.
So you haven't found purely instrumental dichotomies between stuff that sounds happy Western, unhappy to other cultures?
So I'm presenting a framework for how to interpret things and how to handle the subject logically. And if you take a poll of people, who knows what you're going to find out.
To go to the cognitive dissonance thing, wasn't Sousa a prime example of that?
Of cognitive dissonance?
He thought that, primarily that his music were waltzes.
The Stars and Stripes Forever? Well,
one of the most famous applications of that.
Kind of a fast waltz.
Yeah.
It's not false.
It's not.
For someone.
Lyrics.
you've been, you know, playing music and talking about that and this melody and the intensity.
Yeah.
Are you ignoring or overlooking lyrics?
Lyrics are a piece of cake. Everybody can understand and talk about improved lyrics. There are finer analyses of poetry. You don't need me for that.
Do they undercut, or can they undercut, or can they further?
I do
Yes.
have a whole section of the book about that question too, because there can be a wonderful synergy of the lyrics and the music, and that's the best case. But it's also possible to do comedy in which you play with the incongruity between the two. You know, in the Monty Python, Bravely Bold Sir Robin rolled forth from Camelot, it's this bouncy medieval tune, and they're singing about grinding the guy's body to a pulp, and you know, and so it's funny, but that's because of the disparity between the words and the music.
Two questions, kind of simple. One is just so unclear. I enjoyed everyone here today, but just can you, in one sentence, say what your argument is in the book, and just so I can leave with that, because I've gotten a lot of other stuff from you.
Okay.
And the other good, I wanted to give you a quote that I was wondering if you know the quote and if you could respond to it. It's a quote that Beethoven said when he was writing Fidelio.
Yeah.
It was apparently he said this to Goethe in some way, and I'm paraphrasing. The quote is something like this: "There are places I can go in my music that you can never go in your writing," and it's the paraphrase.
Yeah.
But what he was saying was this argument that words have to go through the reasoning mind,
Yep.
and music does not have to go through our minds, as long as we've got ears. So is there any correlation with what your book is about, to
Yeah.
that quote?
So first of all, I agree with that, and second of all, there's a whole section in the book about basically exactly that question.
Okay.
It's music as the highest of the arts. But to come back to your first question,
Yeah.
which is how would I encapsulate the whole thing in one sentence, we can be objective about musical emotion.